Last time, we learned about a dark man who had been haunting Jeremy's dreams. What the dark man wanted of Jeremy remains unknown. Jeremy killed himself before it could be accomplished, but it somehow involves the cavern system beneath the house. We found an entrance to it in the wine cellar, but a monstrous worm blocked our entry. There must be another, somewhere. Maybe the book we picked up holds the key. Trial of Captain Prext, found aboard the wreck of the Astarte, by H. Hartwood, Uncle Jeremy's father. I wonder why he was interested in this Prext person. I thought he was searching for Pickford's treasure. Anyway, the Astarte was a pirate ship. After a long string of failures, they sought refuge in the Florida swamps. Their captain, Ezekiel Prext, went missing one day. When he returned, he told his men that it was the devil who guided them now. What that meant or where he had been, the crew could only guess, but from that point on, the Astarte met only with success, and Prext grew immensely rich. They sang a song on their raids. A skull go to port, saber to starboard, if you cut a rope, cut the right, I hope, and so forth. They sailed to Louisiana, and anchored not far from New Orleans, around where we are now. Prext and a few of his most trusted men carried several chests into the swamp. Prext returned alone with 3 chests, all filled with gold and gems, which he distributed amongst his crew. He said the alligators had killed the other men. That night, Prext took his first mate aside and gave him command of the ship, saying that he was giving up the pirate's life, that he had found a treasure more precious than gold. Prext showed him a map that seemed to be of a maze-like cavern. The mate suddenly noticed a man by Prext's side who he had never seen before, a tall, dark man, dressed in black with cold eyes. In a soft, unsettling voice, the man told Prext that it was time to go. They disappeared into the swamp. Sometime later, I'm not clear how long, the crew apprehended Prext. They believed that he was holding out on them, that the 3 chests were only a fraction of the loot. They threatened to execute him. One pirate waved his hook in the air, crying for him to hang. Prext only laughed. "You want to kill what will never die?" he asked his former crew. Astarte. That's the goddess Pickford said he named Erceto after, wasn't it? And the tall, dark man the mate described. Could that be the dark man of Uncle Jeremy's dreams? How is Prext involved in all of this? We should stop reading books. All that did was raise more questions. Well, let's get started searching for another entrance to the cavern. While we do that, for this final chapter, I thought I'd make a timeline of the entire history of Alone in the Dark, from the start to the end. From before the start, even. Let's go back to Alpha Waves. Early summer, 1990. While it wasn't quite finished, Christophe de Denishaw had already written a playable version of Alpha Waves, which he presented as part of his portfolio when applying for an internship at Infogrames. They offered to buy it outright for 5,000 francs, $950 at the then current exchange rate, or not quite $1,600 in modern money. De Denishaw declined. This was his game, and it would remain so. After much negotiation, Infogrames agreed to license Alpha Waves at a 17% royalty rate. De Denishaw was disappointed at what he thought was a piddling amount, but it was actually the highest rate Infogrames had ever licensed the game for. Midsummer, 1990. Reynal had been employed at Infogrames and porting games to various systems. To date, his most notable work had been the Commodore CD-TV port of SimCity. Reynal saw Alpha Waves and personally wanted to bring it to the PC. Alpha Waves had been written in assembly for the Atari ST. It was not Infogram's policy to port games written in assembly from one system to another, but the code was so well commented that he was sure he could do it with ease. Look at this sword and shield emblem on the wall. You know, Pickford was a pirate, and so was Prext, whatever his connection may be. The Jolly Roger of the notorious Calico Jack showed two cutlasses crossed beneath a skull. Calico Jack was before Pickford's time, but would have been a contemporary of Prext. Cutlasses are a kind of saber. We don't have one, but we do have a cavalry saber, which is similar. There's a mechanism here. What if we cross the saber on the wall with the one we picked up from the third floor study? There's our entrance. December 1990. Reynal finished his PC port of Alpha Waves and the game went to market. While he was working on it, he realized how the remarkably fast 3D rendering engine it used could be further developed to create more complex objects. He began working independently on a game prototype, without any fixed goal in mind beyond a human-shaped player character entirely made of polygons. This bridge doesn't look too sturdy. I don't think we should take any more time crossing it than we have to. Well, there's no turning back now. Hope we've got everything we need from the house. September 1991. Reynal's prototype is finished. It featured the human character he had set out to make in a room. Finding it impossible to render everything in 3D, the backgrounds were flat images. His engine allowed for dynamic camera switching, and the room could be viewed from 4 different angles. He presented this prototype to Infogrames, who were greatly impressed by it, and gave the go-ahead to begin development on the game. Reynal, ever the horror film fan, wanted to create a cinematic game involving zombies and other monsters. The player would begin in the attic of a large house, and the goal would be to survive long enough to discover a way out. There was no plot beyond that. You know, these look like worm tunnels. I hope we don't stumble across Can't go there, big rock blocking path. Don't have time for this, the worm is after me. Okay, now we gotta move fast, it must be right... Or maybe it isn't following me. No, it chewed through the boulder and took the left path. December 1991. The game engine is finished, including all the character actions, the monster AI, inventory system, triggers, everything. All that remained was to model the house, the characters, the objects, and to draw the backgrounds. Oh, and the plot. The game still lacked a plot, but by this time, Reynal's team had increased from 6 to 7, with the addition of a writer, Hubert Chaudot. Chaudot had no video game experience whatsoever. He was a friend of Bruno Banel, and that's how he came to be hired by Infogrames to write Shadow of the Comet. With In the Dark still needing a story, he was assigned to it as well. It was at his suggestion that this game also take a Lovecraftian slant, and the Call of Cthulhu series was born. How are we going to get down from here? Wait, what's this? Emily realized the power of jump? Jumping will become important here in the endgame, and it's a bit sneaky that the action just appears without warning. This game does have fall damage, but that wasn't high enough to trigger it. The Frogman, or Deep One if you prefer, can't leave the water, but he can still hit you for 2 HP. With our new jumping skills, I think we can avoid this rickety bridge entirely. There are some branches and shortcuts, but for the most part, the game becomes fairly linear and more action-oriented down here in the caverns. There's a strange stone door here, but we can't open it with anything we have now. The rat spider has 10 HP, so 2 rifle shots should take care of it. Like the frogman, it hits for 2 HP. April 1992. The characters and objects had been modeled, and the rooms had at least been wireframed. In terms of the background images, which Yayo Burroughs drew most of, the house was finished, but work had yet to begin on the cavern system. It proved to be too big a job for a single person to handle, so they brought on an additional artist, Jean-Marc Torella. Nearly everything down here in the caverns was drawn by him. With the introduction of jumping puzzles had to be next. This bird or giant insect thing flying around is a nuisance. You can ignore it, but if you ever let it get too close, it will home in on you and attack. It only deals 1 HP of damage, but it can easily knock you off the stone pillars into the water. It's better to kill it right away. It's just a matter of good aim and the correct lead. That's 1 hit, 1 more should do it. And there we go. This room isn't too bad to traverse. Emily's jumps have a fixed height and distance, so all you have to worry about is the angle. And the hitboxes on the pillars are generous. There seems to be a passageway down there, but I'd rather keep to the upper path and not risk exploring where the lower one might lead. There's another passageway on the opposite side. Late summer 1992. Alone in the Dark still did not have a story, and with the game finished and the release dates only a few months away, one had to be written, and it had to be written now. Thus the legendary 3-day meeting. Reynal said it was almost like a game of Dungeons & Dragons, with him as the DM, the Derceto floor plans as the map, and the team, the whole Alone in the Dark team, every one of them, role-playing the character and making up the why of what they're doing to advance from one encounter to the next as they went. Shadow, taking notes, would then write the necessary game text. After 3 long days, the story was complete. Late August, possibly early September 1992. At this time, the game was still intended to be the first episode of a Call of Cthulhu series, titled Doom of Derceto. Chaosium, deciding that the game was too far removed from their RPG, demanded the Call of Cthulhu branding be removed, along with all of their original material. We come to a fork. Well, the song the Astarta crew sang said to cut to the right, and warned that if we didn't, that death we would find. So, I think right is the way to go. How much of the game had to be changed following Chaosium's withdrawal is a bit of a question, but there was a mad scramble to retitle it. By late September, it came down to either Screams in the Dark or Alone in the Dark. We all know which they chose, but even as late as October, Screams was still a contender. Now this room looks like it could be an issue. Those catwalks look none too steady. Who could guess which ones might fall out from under you if you tried to tread over them? And there's another flying thing. The strategy guide calls them birds. The clue book leaves it vague with flying creatures. What's this saber doing stuck here in the ground? How did the song go again? A skull go to port, a saber to starboard? There are two options here, the right path or the left path. Port is the left side of a ship, starboard is the right. I think this saber is telling us that the right path is the one to take. Another saber here. Left is an option, but again, saber to starboard. Here's a skull, skull to port, left. Again, we're faced with two options. Personally, I'd rather take the right, since it's moving closer to the goal and away from that flying monster. But the skull here is telling me to take the left. We'll have to shoot the monster down first. It's a bit tricky. The rifle has a kick. Emily could easily lose her balance and fall off this narrow catwalk. We'll have to be much more careful with this bird than we were the first one. Okay, onward! Saber starboard, right again. I don't like getting so close to the water. I'm afraid there could be another frogman around. And so there was. But the upper path will take me out of its reach, and the skull tells me it's safe. October 1992. Reynal, candidly speaking, hated the game. After 2 long years of development, after months of tracking down bugs, after rushing to meet deadlines, after playing the game over and over and over again, all he saw in it were the flaws and the missed opportunities that were now too late to address. He was so convinced by his own disappointment in the game that he was certain everyone else would hate it as well. A chest? Is this the treasure Howard Hartwood was searching for? Locked. Maybe that strange key we got from the ballroom will open it. At least, I hope we got it. Remember, the route we took here from the house was one way. A gem. This can't be Pickford's treasure, it must be Prext's. You know, if it weren't for them being separated by a century, I would think Pickford and Prext were one and the same. Memoirs of a Lost Soul. My suspicions were correct. Pickford was Prext. Or rather, is Prext. After imploring the stones of the Cthulhu cult, Prext says he's lived for over 300 years. His body was burned in the fire that consumed the house in 1862, but he himself was not killed, only immobilized, he says. He needs a living body to regenerate himself. Uncle Jeremy and his father both escaped in death. Now his sights are on us. It all makes sense now. Hesperides' publications, the Hesperides tended to the tree of immortality. The tree in Jeremy's painting represents Prext, and Jeremy is telling us to destroy it, to burn his soul along with his body. That's the only way to defeat someone who can never die. There's a huge boulder over here. I imagine it conceals a passageway. Oh, and the memoir told us that the monstrous worm is a Chthonian. That makes it the only enemy in the game explicitly derived from the Cthulhu mythos. Even then, there's room to deny a connection. The term exists in Greek mythology as well. Chaudot had previously been a journalist, and had worked in programming and distribution at 20th Century Fox. It was after he lost his job at Fox that he joined Infogrames and became an adventure game writer. Like Reynal, he loves horror movies, especially the Hammer horror films, but his fascination with Lovecraft started early, at age 12, when he was introduced to Lovecraft by his grandfather. Other authors he cites as inspiration include Arthur Conan Doyle and Stephen King. Another split in the path. The tunnel continues forward, and there's a door of some kind on the left. But we can't open it. Forward, then. Into the dark maze. We still have oil, right? This is why it was a good idea to minimize our lamp use earlier in the game, especially if you don't know the way. There's another strange stone door over there. I won't even waste time trying to open it. We don't have the correct item. The dark maze isn't especially complicated, but it is large. It also contains islands, so the hugging one wall trick won't necessarily show you the way out. An early idea the creators had for the game was that all of it would be in the dark. The player would start with 3 matches, and would have to complete the game before the last match burned out. The match idea must have been abandoned quickly, but the lantern's oil mechanic is a similar concept. November 1992. Alone in the Dark was released. Reynal may have had his doubts about how well it would be received, but Infogrames was sure of its success. It was an expensive game to produce. Its budget came in at $400,000, but its returns were phenomenal. It sold 2.5 million copies. That may not sound impressive today, but in 1992 it was staggering. Alone in the Dark retailed for $62.95, so that could represent an almost $16 million profit. It's the game that truly elevated infogrames to the world stage. With the success of the first game, a sequel was immediately called for. Reynald's enthusiasm, which had waned over the years he had spent working on Alone in the Dark, was suddenly rekindled. He had great plans for improving upon his engine. Higher resolution, greater polygon counts, real textures, light and shadow effects. Computing power was advancing rapidly. The Intel Pentium processor, introduced in 1993, had a built-in floating point unit, and Reynal thought it may soon be possible to render the game environment in 3D as well, allowing for moving cameras and greater environmental interactivity. This door looks different. Let's drop the lamp and examine it more closely. The indentation in it. It looks like something could be fitted there. Like this gem, perhaps. It would seem Uncle Jeremy's painting wasn't all that symbolic at all. Prext is literally a tree, on an island in a subterranean pond under the house. I think I can see his face in the center of the tree. Below it must be the altar mentioned in the memoir, the one a living body must be placed on to make Prext corporeal again. The Dark Man aids Prext. He was the one who was grooming Jeremy, and he must be the one who would direct the ritual. Jeremy discovered a sign of protection that the Dark Man was unable to cross. He carved it in the floor of the secret room in the library. Maybe... I don't know. I think we need to get a closer look. The water extinguished the lamp and ruined our rifle cartridges. There's another frogman. He managed to kill himself, but he'll be back. A hook. There was a hook mentioned in the book, documenting the trial. Prext's accuser had a hook for a hand. The fireball takes 3 HP if it hits. The talisman we picked up in the library's secret room, it's the same sign of protection. A 5-pointed star in a circle. If we place the talisman on the altar, it might prevent the Dark Man from helping Prext. Now, to burn the tree and destroy his soul. The lamp is out, and the matches are wet, but we still have the lighter. The falling rocks will seldom hit you, but deal 10 HP of damage if they do. It's still very possible to die, even at this stage of the game. This passage is eerily familiar. Here's another of those strange stone doors. We must have something that can fit through the opening. Like the hook. There are a few ways out of here. The long way, the short way, and the one I'm taking, which you might call the medium way. Reynal's enthusiasm for future improvements to his engine was not shared by Bonnell. What Reynal wanted to do would cost time and money, while the engine they already had was serviceable, and a sequel would sell based on the Alone in the Dark name alone. We should be careful running on these catwalks. It's all too easy to slip and... Well, the dark area behind the skull is a passageway. We might as well see where it leads. Bunnell was adamant. To get a sequel released as quickly and as cheaply as possible, there would be no time or budget allotted for any significant changes to the game engine. The disagreements led to a schism in the Alone in the Dark team. Reynal, Yael Barros, Didier Chanfray, and Serge Plagnol quit and left Infogrames to form their own company. Bunnell himself would head the production of Alone in the Dark 2 and 3. Both used the same engine as the first game, hardly modified at all. The third installment was released in North America in 1995, by which time the graphics and controls were already antiquated. Computer Gaming World would describe Part 2 as a bit of a letdown. Part 3 they essentially considered irredeemable. The Alone in the Dark series would soon fade, losing its dominance in the survival horror genre, to be replaced by the games it had inspired, Resident Evil and Silent Hill. With Prex defeated, all of the enemies have vanished. There are still some dangers, but none of the active type. After his bitter departure from Infogrames, Reynal would purposefully stay out of the survival horror genre for nearly a decade, but in 2000 he began work on Agartha. Again, the game was set in the 1920s, and again it followed the adventures of an older protagonist in an isolated environment where a Lovecraftian cult is attempting to summon an ancient evil. If you think the plot sounds very Alone in the Dark-esque, I agree with you. I like to imagine that Agartha is the direction Reynal would have taken the Alone in the Dark series had he been allowed to. That's where the Chthonian chewed through the boulder. I'm not exactly sure where we're going. We can't return the way we came. The bridge collapsed behind us. Wait, that's where the Chthonian came from. Now that he's gone, we can see where that path leads. Agartha was not intended to be a PC game. It was being written for the Sega Dreamcast. In March of 2001, Sega discontinued the Dreamcast, and announced that there would be no new console to replace it. Sega was effectively exiting the console business. I know where we are now. You may be wondering, are you trapped down here if you didn't uncover the opening in the wine cellar? No, you aren't. Emily will push the casks out of the way if they're still blocking the passage. Even those detestable rats are gone. No cliché, the company producing Agartha was owned by Sega Europe. After the discontinuation of the Dreamcast, Sega Europe cancelled all Dreamcast games currently in development. That included Agartha. Reynal is still active in the field, but has not developed any large-scale games since. In 2006, Reynal, along with Michel Ancel and Shigeru Miyamoto, was made a Knight of the Order of Arts and Letters for, and I quote, significant contribution to the enrichment of the French cultural inheritance. It was the first time the honor had ever been given to a video game developer. The house is quiet. All the enemies are gone. Could it really be over? I'm not even going to pretend that that makes sense in the context of the story, but just as everything else in Alone in the Dark was inspired by horror movies, so was the ending. Raynell said that this sort of "it's all over, or is it?" ending was such a horror cliche that, of course, that's how the game had to end. There are many examples that may have served as a model, but I don't think you could find a more perfect one than the end of A Nightmare on Elm Street. That's the end of the game. But not of the LP. There's still more to explore in the world of Alone in the Dark.